From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon. I'm Jane McAuliffe, the Director of National and International Outreach at the Library of Congress, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this afternoon's lecture. This is, of course, the point at which I ask you to silence your cell phones, and also mention to you that this is being filmed and will be posted on both the library and the Kluge Center websites, because this event is being hosted by the John W. Kluge Center. The Kluge Center is located right next door to this room, and it is the part of the Library of Congress, very generously funded by the philanthropist John W. Kluge, where we support, showcase, and celebrate scholarship. We support it by hosting over 100 scholars in any given year, junior scholars or senior scholars like today's distinguished lecturer. We showcase scholarship by events like this, a whole series of lectures and panels and symposia that the Kluge Center mounts throughout the year. And we celebrate scholarship by awarding every few years the Kluge Prize for the Study of Humanity, which was awarded most recently last September to Jürgen Habermas and Charles Taylor. Today's lecture is titled Humanity in Crisis: Ethical Responsibilities to People Displaced by War. And our speaker is Dr. David Hollenbach, who was in residence at the Kluge Center this past fall. When in residence, he held the Cary and Anne Maguire Chair in Ethics and American History. That chair was created to enable a distinguished thinker to spend a period of residence at the Library of Congress exploring America's history with special attention to the ethical dimensions of our country's economic, political, and social policies. The chair was a gift to the Library of Congress and to the nation by Mr. Cary Maguire, and we are delighted to have Mr. Cary Maguire with us today. On behalf of all of us, I would like to thank you, Mr. Maguire, for your extraordinary generosity in giving this chair to the Library of Congress and the nation. Thank you. Our lecturer, Dr. David Hollenbach, is the University Chair in Human Rights and International Justice at Boston College, where he is also the director of the Center for Human Rights and International Justice. He was educated at St. Joseph's University with a Bachelor of Science in Physics, and then an MA from St. Louis University, and finally a Ph.D. in Religious Ethics from Yale University. Dr. Hollenbach has published extensively on Christian ethics, Christian social ethics, human rights, refugees, contemporary theories of justice, and the role of religion in public life. He's the author of hundreds of articles and the author or editor of 9 books. Some of the best-known titles are The Common Good and Christian Ethics, The Global Face of Public Faith, Politics, Human Rights, and Christian Ethics. That was first published in 2003 and then issued in Chinese in 2013. Refugee Rights, Ethics, Advocacy, and Africa, published in 2008, and finally, Driven from Home, Protecting the Rights of Forced Migrants, published in 2010. Dr. Hollenbach's books have been awarded prizes. He's been honored by major professional societies. He's received numerous honorary degrees, and he is currently the president-elect of the Catholic Theological Society of America. At the Kluge Center last fall, David Hollenbach's research focused on his current book project, tentatively titled Humanity in Crisis: Religious and Ethical Responses to War and Disaster. This book is exploring the role of faith-based communities in responding to humanitarian crises. I think he must have enjoyed his time in D.C., because starting this summer, he'll be back. He's just been appointed the Pedro Rupe Distinguished Research Professor in Georgetown's School of Foreign Service, and also a senior fellow at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown. So it would be wonderful to have him across town. But before then, we will hear from him this afternoon. Dr. Hollenbach.
Thank you very much. I want to express my sincere gratitude to the John Kluge Center here at the Library of Congress, and especially to Mr. Cary Maguire for enabling me to be here at the library with his support during the past fall semester. I want to thank Jane McAuliffe, the former director of the Kluge Center, who invited me to be here at the Kluge Center during the past fall. I want to thank Robert Gallucci, who is the center's current director, and also the entire staff of the Kluge Center, who made my time here so congenial and so supportive. The Kluge Center here at the library is an ideal place for research. The serenity here is in some ways the very antithesis of the conditions faced by the people who were the focus of my work while I was here. Their struggles, the struggles of these people whom I was working on while I was here, may be indicated by the title of my address this afternoon, namely Humanity in Crisis. A recent study defined humanitarian crises as, quote, any situation in which there is widespread threat to life, physical safety, health, or basic subsistence that is beyond the coping capacity of the individuals and communities in which they reside. I can assure you from some of my visits to places like South Sudan, Rwanda, that people displaced by war, especially those displaced in vast numbers, often face threats that go beyond their coping capacity, the very opposite of the kind of support I received here in the fall. My concern this afternoon is with our ethical responsibilities to people who are facing these humanitarian crises. And I'm using the term humanitarian in a way shaped by the principles of the International Committee of the Red Cross. Some people regard the ICRC as the gold standard of humanitarian action. But in the principles of the International Committee of the Red Cross, humanity is used in a way that has two meanings. It refers, first of all, to the whole of humankind. To act with humanity, therefore, calls for inclusive concern for all members of the human family on the basis of their need, not because of their nationality, race, or religion. Secondly, humanity is a spirit that is sometimes called humaneness. It is compassion for those who are suffering, a virtue quite similar to Christian love. Humanity, in this sense, seeks to alleviate serious distress, especially when that distress exceeds the coping capacity of those who are affected. The scope of humanitarian crises has grown dramatically in recent years, as is evident from the growing number of people displaced by war. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees tells us that the number of people displaced by war, intrastate strife, and human rights violations reached 59.5 million globally last year, 8.3 million more than just a year earlier. This is the largest increase in the number of displaced persons ever recorded for a single year. The number of displaced people, it is estimated, will exceed 61 million by the end of this year, 2016. These people have no choice about moving. The conditions they face, often due to conflict, put their most basic human rights on the line, often including their right to life. For example, the massive displacement in the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of the Congo has been caused by ethnic conflict, armed rebellion, and resulting disease and malnutrition that has led to more than 5 million deaths over the past decade. Well, what can we say about our responsibilities in the face of these crises and the suffering they cause? As the number of people seeking asylum from such grave threats has risen in recent years, secular political philosophers such as Joseph Cairns and refugee scholars such as Philip Marfleet have been arguing that the time has come to consider making borders fully open to all who are fleeing from persecution, conflict, or disaster. In a similar way, similar spirit, several years ago, the philosopher Martha Nussbaum argued that a cosmopolitan community of all human beings should have primacy over narrower communities defined in terms of nationality, ethnicity, or religion. Indeed, Nussbaum called nationality, in her words, a morally irrelevant characteristic of personhood. Such a cosmopolitan vision can be given Christian religious backing. For example, during his recent visit to the island of Lesbos in Greece on the border with Turkey, Pope Francis told Syrian refugees there who were seeking entrance to Europe that, quote, God created humankind to be one family. The Pope then called Europe to build bridges and to recoil from putting up walls. And then he turned around and took 12 Syrian refugees, all Muslim, back to the Vatican with him in his plane. Pope Francis was drawing on the book of Genesis' teaching that all persons are created in the image of God, making them brothers and sisters in a single human family that reaches across national borders. The universality of human dignity in a similar way led Pope John XXIII back in 1963 to insist, I quote, the fact that one is a citizen of a particular state does not detract in any way from one's membership in the human family as a whole, nor from one's membership in the world community. So, a strong defense of the common humanity among all of us that should affect our response to people in crisis. Nevertheless, this philosophical and Christian universalism calls not only for the support of the unity of the human family, but it also calls, I would submit, that we are obligated to respect the differences among peoples, cultures, and nations. In her recent writings, Martha Nussbaum now draws upon Grotius and Kant to argue that people exercise their freedom and express their dignity when they shape the institutions of their own nation-state. Protecting the independence of accountable states is thus, for Nussbaum today, a way of protecting human dignity. In a similar way, Christian theologians like St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas have affirmed that there is a Christian duty to love all human beings as our neighbors, but also a duty in Christian love to show distinctive concern for those with whom we have special relationships, such as members of our own families. or our fellow citizens. Christian ethics thus acknowledges our special duties toward co-citizens, while also forbidding actions that effectively treat those from other communities who are in grave need as if they were non-human or non-persons. A key issue for the ethics of response to people facing humanitarian crisis is thus what kind of priorities should we be giving to this universal concern for all and this special concern for those with whom we have special relations. A special concern, a set of priorities that Augustine and Aquinas call the ordo amoris, the ordering of our loves. The humanitarian crises of today call us to reflect carefully on the relative weights of the obligations and rights that arise from our common humanity and from our distinctive identities. What I want to do today is to suggest several priorities, focusing first on our negative duties that are relevant to the crises caused by war today, and then on several positive duties to aid those who are facing crises. Key negative duties relative to the humanitarian crises caused by conflict today can be highlighted by drawing upon the moral tradition known as the just war ethic. This tradition distinguishes between morally legitimate and morally illegitimate uses of force, so it should probably be called the just and unjust war tradition, rather than suggesting that it implies that all wars are just. This tradition has roots in Christian thought, especially in Catholicism, but it also overlaps with the tradition of the international law of armed conflict. In its modern form, the just-unjust war tradition draws a sharp line between force used in the defense of human rights and force used to violate human rights. The jus ad bellum of just cause requires that force be strictly limited to defending the rights of innocent persons to life, freedom, and security, and the rights of nation-states to self-determination and territorial integrity. Conversely, there is a negative duty not to use force aggressively against other peoples or to deny them their political freedom, to exploit them economically, or because they are culturally different. Violation of these negative duties is both immoral and, according to international law, criminal. Sadly, this is just what happened in perhaps the worst humanitarian crisis of recent times, the Rwanda genocide of 1994, where force was massively used to deny the most basic rights of the Tutsi people in Rwanda. It was also appallingly violated in the slaughter at Srebrenica, where thousands of Bosnian Muslims were killed because of their identity as Bosnian Muslims as part of an ethnic cleansing. Similarly, the just war norms also forbid direct and intentional attacks on civilians, as well as collateral harm to civilians that is disproportionate to the good being sought. International law sets forth similar prohibitions in the Geneva Conventions, which insist that civilians must be distinguished from soldiers and protected both from direct attack and from disproportionate collateral harm. Violations of these standards are war crimes and can become crimes against humanity if they are widespread and systematic. Regrettably, some recent conflicts in our world today have become humanitarian crises precisely because of violations of these moral and legal prohibitions. For example, tactics used in the civil war that began in South Sudan in December 2013, just a short time after South Sudan had become an independent country. The tactics used then have regularly violated the rights of civilians to security. Human Rights Watch and a UN panel of experts both concluded that the government of South Sudan and the opposition forces as well had, quote, committed extraordinary acts of cruelty that amount to war crimes and in some cases crimes against humanity. Because of this mayhem, by July 2015, over 1.6 million South Sudanese had become internally displaced, and over 750,000 had become refugees. The strategies and tactics used by both sides in South Sudan have themselves turned South Sudan into a situation of grave humanitarian emergency. The Syrian crisis reinforces the conclusion that armed conflict can lead to humanitarian crisis when the adversaries violate their duty not to attack the basic rights of civilians. The UN's Independent Commission of Inquiry on Syria concluded that, quote, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and human rights violations were so severe that the Syrian reality should shock the conscience of humanity. These violations have led to the single largest forced migration in recent history. The flight of refugees has threatened the stability of neighboring countries, including Turkey, which today hosts the single largest number of refugees of any country in the world, Lebanon, where 1 out of every 4 persons inside the boundaries of Lebanon is a Syrian refugee, and Jordan. Syrian displacement has also, as we know, strained the politics of the European Union in very recent months. The International Criminal Court was established in 1998 to hold people accountable for violations of standards of international law like these. The Rome Statute that created the court gave it jurisdiction over genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and the crime of aggression. The ICC has so far not been able to bring to trial some of those it has charged with such atrocities due to its lack of effective enforcement mechanisms. For example, Omar al-Bashir of Jordan, Khartoum, the northern part of what used to be the one Jordan, faces charges of genocide and crimes against humanity for his actions in the Darfur region. But obtaining his arrest has so far been impossible, although we better not go back to South Africa after a recent decision of the South African Supreme Court that he should have been arrested when he was there the last time. Charges against Uhuru Kenyatta of Kenya had to be dropped because the International Criminal Court prosecutor was unable to get witnesses to testify, largely because most people think their lives were on the line or that some of them had been massively bribed. Nevertheless, the court has had success in some other cases, and other international criminal tribunals have succeeded in bringing other people who conducted these kinds of atrocities to account for their actions. These moves by some of these international criminal tribunals at least encourage me to think that accountability for these kinds of violations is increasing. Duties not to violate basic rights in conflict are more likely to be enforced today than in the past, although we're far from where we should be. And those who violate such norms are less likely to get away with it today than they were in the past, but with still a long way to go. Regrettably, we have learned from history and from insight into human moral weakness that threats to human rights of this sort are probably going to continue. This raises the question of what positive obligations we have to come to the assistance of those who face crisis-level suffering because of their violation of human rights. If people fail to follow their negative duties not to commit these crimes, what kind of positive duty do we have to actually take some action to come to their aid? Here, I want to draw on a mode of moral analysis that was originally developed in the 1970s in the context of debates about who had duties to eliminate the apartheid regime that separated South African people by race and did such harm to so many black South Africans for so many years. Some maintained that those who had not created the apartheid system had no duty to try to change it. It was the South Africans' duty to change the regime, not us Americans or Europeans. But a very different ethical approach was proposed by several scholars at Yale University who argued that under certain circumstances, persons, communities, or institutions can have positive duties to help remedy harms they themselves did not cause. They called their approach the Kew Gardens principles, for it arose from reflection by these scholars at Yale on a tragic case that occurred in the Kew Gardens section of New York City way back in the mid-60s. According to press reports, a young woman named Kitty Genovese was viciously assaulted, stabbed, and died a slow death while 38 nearby people watched and did nothing, some failing to call the police. It has since been learned that the initial reports of what happened were not entirely accurate. But the public outrage at what happened to Kitty Genovese, stimulated by the press reports, points to the fact that most people, anyway, have a conviction that it is not enough not to cause harm. In some situations, one has a duty to come to the aid of people one has not harmed. A sin of omission can, in some circumstances, be as morally objectionable as a sin of commission. Drawing on this conviction, the Kew Gardens principles developed by the Yale authors argues that an agent has a positive responsibility to help others when 4 conditions are present. First, there is a critical need. Second, the agent has proximity to the need. Third, the agent has a capability of responding. And fourth, the agent is likely the last resort from whom help can be expected. Subsequent reflection has added a 5th condition, namely that the action can be taken without disproportionate harm to the one providing help. These 5 criteria, of course, cannot be applied mechanically, but I think they can help us think about the scope of our positive responsibilities in the face of the crisis-level suffering that is occurring in places like Syria and South Sudan today. For example, there can be little doubt that grave need exists in Syria and South Sudan today. Those inside the borders of these crisis-torn countries are vulnerable to harms that could lead to their deaths or to the violation of their other basic rights. Secondly, the duty to respond to such need falls upon those whose proximity to the crisis makes them more likely to have knowledge of the need and also better understanding of how to respond to the need. This means, of course, that the government of the nation where the crisis is occurring and the local communities within that region bear the prime responsibility for addressing the need involved. In South Sudan and Syria, for example, therefore, both the governments and the opposition forces in each country have both the negative duty to stop the atrocities they are causing and the positive duty to help lift the burdens the suffering has already caused. The duty to take positive action, however, does not end at the national borders of the countries where the crisis is present. When people become aware of a crisis in a neighboring country or even in a country at a great distance, this awareness leads to what might be called intellectual or psychological proximity. It puts people, even at a distance, in moral proximity to those who are suffering. There has been helpful, though imperfect, response to the duties arising from proximity by the countries neighboring South Sudan. The regional organization of Sudan's neighboring countries, namely Djibouti, Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, Sudan, Uganda, and Eritrea, an organization that is called the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, IGAD, abbreviated as. IGAD has played a diplomatic role in seeking to mediate the conflict within South Sudan that began in 2013, as it did during the earlier effort to bring the comprehensive peace agreement to Sudan that ended the conflict between northern and southern Sudan that ultimately led to the independence of South Sudan. Regrettably, the economic and political self-interest of these countries in IGAD has sometimes distorted their mediation efforts, leading particularly of Uganda and Ethiopia, which has in turn led several countries at even greater distances outside the region to become involved in mediating the diplomatic efforts to bring an end to the South Sudan crisis through an initiative called IGAD Plus, which includes not only South Sudan's neighbors, but also the African Union, the United Nations, China, the US, the United Kingdom, Norway, and the European Union. A sense of moral responsibility arose in these more distant countries because of their proximity through awareness, what I'm calling moral proximity. These combined regional and global mediation efforts have been far from perfect, to be sure. However, a fragile peace process is underway, and there's even a sign of hope that it may be leading to a positive outcome. Even today, new news of Riek Machar returning back to Juba with the possibility of moving back into the government to heal some of the wounds that are there. At least there's a hope that this could happen. And it points to the fact that distant neighbors can make a difference in addressing these crises. The criterion of capability also sheds light on the positive duties to respond to humanity in crisis. In considering this issue, it has become common to point out that someone who cannot swim does not have a duty to come to the aid of a child who is drowning in a rapidly flowing river if aid requires swimming some distance that the person is incapable of. On the other hand, a good swimmer could have a duty to come to the aid of such a child in the river. Lebanon, Turkey, and Jordan are already massively overburdened by the Syrian refugees. In my judgment, they do not possess the economic resources to provide asylum for additional refugees in the current situation. On the other hand, the resources of the wealthy countries of Northern Europe, North America, and the oil-producing Gulf states gives them the capability to receive many more asylum seekers than they are, and to share the burdens being carried by Syria's already overburdened neighbors by providing financial assistance to those surrounding neighbors. The assistance being provided to the countries bordering on Syria, financial, is woefully inadequate. Our capability, it seems to me, gives us a duty both to receive more Syrian refugees than we have, and especially to do much more to provide direct financial assistance and other forms of technological and humanitarian aid to help Syria's near neighbors deal with the massive number of refugees they are dealing with. The responsibility of the doctrine of the responsibility to protect that was affirmed at the 2005 General Assembly of the UN's World Summit states that the international community can have positive duties to help protect populations from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. Such crimes are clearly occurring in Syria and South Sudan today. In the first instance, such protective efforts should be through diplomatic, humanitarian, and peaceful means. But if such peaceful initiatives do not succeed, however, the use of armed force can become a legitimate way to carry out the duty to protect people from violations of their rights that reach the level of atrocity. The responsibility to protect doctrine, of course, has been the focus of much controversy, heated controversy, since it was first proclaimed by the UN in 2005. Political realists oppose it because they hold that foreign policy should be determined by the interests of one's own people, not by a supposed moral responsibility to other lands. Others see the responsibility to protect as a form of neo-imperialism, an expansion of what the French used to call the advancement of civilization. Still others say that what happened in Libya shows that the responsibility to protect doesn't work, and that what's happening in Syria today shows that it can't work. Despite these critiques, it is important to note that the responsibility to protect has been invoked on a number of occasions since 2005, and that it has in fact led to the effective protection of people from grave human rights violations. For example, when conflict flared in Kenya following the disputed 2007 elections, Kofi Annan said that he looked at the crisis through the prism of the responsibility to protect. This led him to initiate and to stimulate others to follow in creating diplomatic interventions in Kenya by the UN, the African Union, a number of other governments from Africa and around the world, including the United States. Condoleezza Rice went there herself to try to mediate the crisis in Kenya following the election. A power-sharing agreement was reached between the two forces that were adversaries in Kenya, and the downward spiral into civil war and what some feared was moving toward genocide was actually stopped. The Kenyan case illustrates, in my judgment, that the responsibility to protect can be successfully carried out through nonviolent political and diplomatic initiatives. The responsibility to protect doctrine has also been invoked on several occasions in the past decade to justify the use of military force to protect people from grave atrocities. In 2012, with the UN Security Council approval, France and the Economic Community of West African States took military action in pursuit of peace in Mali. And in 2013, the Security Council supported the use of force by France and the African Union to stop atrocities in the Central African Republic. These cases, Mali and Cary, Central African Republic, indicate to me that the responsibility to protect can remain a viable option in grave crisis. Two other cases, however, Libya and Syria, cause others to question this. In the Libya case, the UN authorized action to protect civilians when fears arose that Gaddafi was about to commit atrocities. He had done a lot of bad things already, but there was fear that he was even going to do worse things. For example, when he referred to his adversaries in Benghazi as cockroaches. This is the very epithet that the Hutus used of the Tutsi during the midst of the Rwanda genocide. And it led a number of people to think that Gaddafi was on the verge of an extermination of his adversaries. As a result, the Security Council, with the notable support of the Organization of the Islamic Conference and the League of Arab States, called for the use of, quote, all necessary measures to protect civilians. NATO intervened with air power. Gaddafi was killed, and his regime was overthrown. Sadly, and this is what leads the critics to say R2P doesn't work, Libya has fallen into political chaos, with armed conflicts among several groups, significant violations of human rights continuing on the basis of religion, and the unsafe flight of migrants across the Mediterranean from Libya. These consequences confirm some in the conviction that pursuing humanitarian goals not required by national self-interest is likely to do more harm than good. I would argue, however, that the intervention in Libya failed, not because it was excessive, but because it was incomplete. Following the norms that my colleagues in ethics today call jus post bellum, justice following conflict, NATO and the U.S. should have followed up their intervention with action to rebuild Libya and to prevent the chaos that developed. What happened in Libya was, in my judgment, an incomplete implementation of the responsibility to protect, not a simple failure. Syria has also been invoked to suggest that the responsibility to protect is dead. The political complexities and moral ambiguities of the Syrian situation surely go very deep. But these complexities, in my view, do not discredit the notion of the responsibility to protect. Thomas Weiss has argued that the wisdom of the use of military force to protect people from atrocities is governed by three factors: legality, moral legitimacy, and feasibility. In Syria, it is clear that the legal prohibitions of war crimes and of other atrocities have been violated. The moral legitimacy of efforts to stop a conflict that has displaced over half the entire Syrian population and killed hundreds of thousands of Syrians is also evident. The issue, of course, is feasibility. Feasibility of military intervention to alleviate the crisis. And this, I think, this feasibility is unclear. This does not undermine the idea that there is a responsibility to protect people from atrocity. The apparent lack of a presently feasible way to overcome the crisis in Syria, I would argue, calls for additional political and diplomatic initiatives to find a path forward. Not only Assad and the rebels, but also Russia, Iran, the Gulf states, and some others are keeping the crisis in Syria alive. The United States has a duty, in my judgment, to engage these powers in the pursuit of peace through continuing political and diplomatic engagement. In my judgment, Secretary Cary is on the right path here. Outside of Syria itself, what is our responsibility to the large number of Syrians presently seeking asylum in Europe and other parts of the developed world? We should reaffirm the United Nations 1951 Refugee Convention's affirmation that refugees fleeing persecution should be granted asylum elsewhere. Countries in Europe and North America have the capability and the resources to grant asylum to a considerably larger number of refugees from Syria and South Sudan than we are doing today. Indeed, the number of Syrians seeking asylum in Europe is not even close to the number already within the borders of Syria's neighbors. For example, in the fall of last year when Prime Minister David Cameron of the United Kingdom announced that his country would grant asylum to 20,000 Syrian refugees over the next 5 years. He was appropriately reminded that Lebanon had admitted that number of Syrian refugees over the last 2 weekends. Indeed, developing countries today host 86% of all the world's refugees. And the very poorest countries of the world are providing asylum to 25% of the global total of refugees. The rich nations of the North, like us, have the capability and therefore the responsibility to admit a larger number of asylum seekers, and even more, I would say, to assist these poorer countries who are already hosting the most of the world's refugees. The funds being provided for this burden sharing by us in the North need to be substantially increased. To achieve this, the rich nations of the Northern Hemisphere will have to overcome tendencies to racially and religiously driven xenophobia and overcome the mistaken fear that most terrorists have come in as refugees. Most terrorists are actually native-born people, born within the French terrorists who took action in Paris, and those who took action in Brussels were all born in France and Belgium. A country with a history of military involvement in another country can also have special obligations. For example, the United States recognized its particular duty to receive refugees from Vietnam after the Vietnam War. Though the U.S. intervention in Iraq was certainly not the sole cause of displacement of many Iraqis in the world today, it was surely the occasion of the huge forced migration of Iraqis that followed. And political scientist Stephen Walt recently observed in a somewhat cynical column that if the United States and its allies had not invaded Iraq in 2003, there would almost certainly be no Islamic State today, which would then be raising questions about our duty toward the people being displaced by the Islamic State. If we had not intervened, it seems to me, there would surely be fewer people seeking asylum from Iraq and Syria today. This deepens our duties toward those refugees, in my judgment. Finally, I recognize that there are reasons to wonder whether national self-interest will not almost always overshadow the duties that I've been sketching and that I am advocating. Nevertheless, I am encouraged by the recent work of Martha Finnemore and Catherine Sickink, two distinguished political scientists, whose work shows the positive impact of people who have been advocating for normative ethical standards in some domains of contemporary international politics. The standards of international law of armed conflict were the result of normative advocacy by groups such as the Red Cross over the past century, leading to the creation of the Geneva Conventions. More recently, though the International Criminal Court is still by all means a developing institution, Finnemore and Sickink have argued that normative entrepreneurs, as they call them, have advanced the effort to hold political leaders accountable for violating standards through the action of several international criminal tribunals, not only the International Criminal Court, but the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, etc. This suggests that contrary to the standard realist argument, ethical standards can come to have real impact on the conduct of nations. My hope is that strong ethical pressure, including pressure from faith-based agencies like the pressure we saw from the Pope in Lesbos just a few weeks ago, that this pressure will lead to more action in accord with the responsibilities that I have incompletely sketched here today, and that I hope to treat in considerably greater depth in the book that I'm writing thanks to my stay at the Kluge Center. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hollenbach. I think you have whetted our appetite for some questions, and you have graciously agreed to take a few if there are some in the audience. When you pose a question, would you please make it a question and identify yourself before doing so? Thank you.
Thank you so much for this very stimulating talk. My name is Theo Christoph. I'm a Kluge Fellow. I wanted to push more on the philosophical question and to think about the distinction between duty and responsibility. And my sense from your discussion was that you used both interchangeably in the talk. And here's the context. In the late 17th century, the German theorist Pufendorf speaks of the responsibility to protect only on condition that, in fact, that help is needed by the people who are suffering, and that's their call. So the distinction that he makes is between duty and responsibility, that duty comes with responsibility, but responsibility is not necessarily dutiful. So from that context, I wanted to invite you to think about how can we respond to the current crisis that you're discussing by using that distinction between duty and responsibility, and would that change any part of your argument? Thank you.
Well, that's a very interesting question. I am not familiar with Pufendorf's distinction. So maybe you could give me an illustration of what's a duty and what's a responsibility, so I know a little better about what you're asking me to clarify about the contemporary scene. I'm not fully clear on what the distinction is.
So the context comes in Pufendorf. He's attacking essentially Vittoria, a classicist scholastic, on the question of the Amerindians, that in fact the Amerindians, do they have a right to be dispossessed by the Europeans, or can they just be dispossessed without their right? So what he says is that, in fact, we can only protect people who are calling for our help, as opposed to, on humanitarian ground, without the help of people, we can intervene at any point. And that's the distinction between duty and responsibility, the moral question versus the political realism, which you sort of addressed at the very end of the talk.
You're suggesting that responsibility is more response to a call, whereas duty is sort of initiated by me. Well, I'm not. I'd have to think about that much more carefully. One of the ways in which I do think about it, though, is to say that the very dignity of the person is already a kind of call to me to respond in a way that supports that dignity. I mean, one way to think of it is to think about the dignity of the person is already a kind of ought toward me, that it speaks to me and says, don't violate me. Or if I am in deep being submerged in crisis, it can call out to me the very dignity of the person, not the words the person uses, but the very humanity of the person is a kind of call to me. And that's the way I would start thinking about this. I'd want to go back and see what's at stake, though, in the argument about indigenous Americans and what kind of argument Pufendorf is making there. I know that Vittoria was very strong in making an argument about the need to protect these people from the kind of abuse that some of the Spanish colonial practices were exerting upon them. But I'm not sure how Pufendorf dealt with that, but I would certainly respond to one way that, well, maybe that's enough to say, and we can move to another question. Bruce Gentleson is looking there to ask a question. I know we were neighbors when I was here at the Kluge Center in the fall.
Yes, absolutely, and always enjoyed talking with you in a fabulous talk today.
Thank you, Bruce. I appreciate that.
Let me pick up on the last point you made about national interest, because I think the way you laid things out was really very powerful. And I'm wondering whether the Syria case, in the Rwanda case, as awful as the humanitarian issue was, some people would say it was a stretch to say that interests were at stake, even though you and I might agree they were. But here in Syria, we have a situation where the awful humanitarian situation has impacted, as you said, the stability of many states in the region.
Even the EU.
And then, of course, to Europe now. And so anybody who would say, well, it's really a terrible thing, it's just about, values, could there possibly be, and maybe a way towards the end of your book, to say that these really, in a globalized, interconnected world, that the dichotomy between interests and ideals really holds up less, and there's more of a kind of cross connection between them?
I fully agree with that. I certainly don't want to make it as if the whole response to my argument today is all about ethics and self-interest has nothing to do with it. I do think that there are real self-interests involved. I mean, it's not only what's happening. I mean, if this crisis with the Syrian refugees leads to the disintegration of the European Union, I mean, that's really serious business. I mean, the European Union has been the source of peace in Europe for since the Second World War, or the Union more recently, but we don't want to repeat of World War I and World War II, and finding ways to prevent that is in our self-interest, it seems to me. Now, that's not the only self-interested piece. The response to the whole Middle Eastern situation, if this Syria crisis flows over and into other regions of the Middle East, especially if we weren't producing cheap oil the way we are right now because of fracking, which raises another whole question, but we'll deal with fracking another day. But there is a self-interest involved in keeping peace in these regions, and that means responding to these crises. So I think they go together. The other thing is that from a normative point of view, this probably comes from my Catholic background rather than from another approach. I'm not entirely sure that drawing a sharp distinction between self-interest and purely altruistic other interest is a legitimate way to think about ethics. I think my well-being and others' well-being are inherently interconnected with each other. That goes back to Aristotle talking about the fact that a human being is a social being. We are interdependent on each other throughout our whole lives. So to think of a pure self-interest that's totally dissociated from any concern for others doesn't make sense in terms of the kind of beings we are. We're not little atoms separated from each other. And the growing globalization and interdependence economically and culturally and politically makes that even more obvious today than it would have been some time ago. So I'm very much in agreement with your direction. Yes.
Hello, David. I'm Jim Lund. I'm now with Bread
Hi,
for the
Jim.
World.
Good to see you.
Good to see you. Let me just say that the first time I heard you lecture was in 1977, and I still remember what you said.
Well, that's amazing. I don't.
And so I thought I'd wander up Capitol Hill to hear you today. So thank you very much for your insights and wisdom here today. I didn't hear you talk much about last resort. Now, I think the situation in South Sudan, the situation in Sierra, self-evidently, we're in a situation of last resort with the millions of people that are affected. But could you talk a little bit about that from a philosophical framework, too?
Well, I think that probably touches on what Tom Weiss calls feasibility also. Certainly, last resort is invoked in the just war tradition to say you don't start using force if you could take another initiative diplomatically that would solve the problem without the use of armed force. It follows from the fact that the use of armed force involves killing people. And you don't do that if you really take seriously the thou shalt not kill commandment. unless it's the only way to protect innocent people from being killed. And that means last resort comes into play there. So finding steps that would take action to, I mentioned Kenya. Kenya is an example of a diplomatic implementation of the responsibility to protect that did not involve the use of armed force. Following the election there, it looked like Kenya was going to fall apart into an ethnic war. The major ethnic groups of Kenya have been divided for a long time. It felt very much, it looked like that. And that's why there was a sense that we've got to do something to prevent another Rwanda. That was Kofi Annan's position. And Kofi Annan had been the director of peacekeeping operations during the Rwanda genocide, which led him to be very sensitive to this, because he had failed to take the action needed in Rwanda to prevent what happened there. So he took action, but it was not military action. And I think to say that's a good example of the use of force should be only in the last resort. If you can find ways to take those diplomatic maneuvers that will solve the problem and protect people, do it. Don't intervene militarily. Now, in Syria, I think we've probably reached the point of saying that if we could militarily intervene and do so, there's another criterion of just war theory called reasonable hope of success. You don't want to intervene militarily if you don't have a good hope that it's going to make the situation better. The fear is that a military intervention by the United States in Syria today would make the situation worse. And that's where I think last resort, as well as reasonable hope of success, may point to saying we've got to take other steps to try to move in a new direction. I don't know what those are. I know Secretary Cary has been really working hard on it, and he's taken some steps that have moved in the right direction, but we're way far removed from where we are. I do think our remaining obligation is to make sure we do something more to help all these people who are being displaced, these millions of Syrian refugees. Anyway, I'm just thinking out loud about this. I'm not answering the question because I don't think there's a clear answer to the Syrian question that looks so perfectly beautiful and solves the problem. Yes, sir.
I want to compliment you on a brilliant talk first.
Oh, well, thank you so much. I'm very grateful.
But I also want to introduce a new thought here. My slogan for 2016-17 is that we cannot afford war any longer. Now just think about that. Every country in the world seems to be consumed with debt, consumed with other projects that are worthwhile. So I want to think about the thought, well, we can't afford war anymore. And it's a Catholic idea that we all need each other. Now, I'm in the oil business, so I know what the price of oil dropping is. But I also think it's good for the world, too. And so, but on the other hand, the last time Reagan dropped the price of oil in a war with the Russians, 3,000 independent oil companies went out of business. I used to be a bank director, and I will predict a lot of oil companies, small oil companies, will go out of business again. Now, what's that got to do with the price of eggs? I say that if we can't afford war anymore, then we ought to be talking about that. And from a religious point of view, we've been talking about that for centuries. So just want to throw that out as a thought. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I'm certainly very much in agreement with it. Finding alternatives to war is a very extremely important step. I've been challenged by some of my colleagues in the ethics area for saying that I still hold the possibility of some legitimate use of armed force. Some people want to say it's totally unacceptable today. The only thing that has led me to not move in that direction is having spent some time in Rwanda and having seen the aftermath of what happened there, which could have been prevented. General Romeo Dallaire, who was the Canadian general in charge of the Rwandan peacekeeping troops, said that if he had had 5,000 more peacekeeping troops, he could have saved 300,000 lives. Well, that use of armed force I'm in favor of, if you can do that. So, but that's not the same as the kind of war we've got in Syria today, that's for sure.
Yes, sir. I'm Ronald Wilson with Social Security Administration. The question I have is, do you ever envision a scenario in the future when all nations would be stable and the burden of R2P would be adhered to by all nations so that there would not be a flow of refugees? Or do you think because of the history of humanity that the burden of R2P will always be on the international community?
Well, I would love to think that we could move in that direction. I'm not enormously hopeful that we're getting there. I do think that there's likely to be some continuing serious conflict, and that's one of the reasons why I have argued for why we have these positive duties to take action to help people who are facing these crisis situations. Negatively, I would like to think we could get people to be serious enough about adhering to the Geneva Conventions and the UN Charter and so forth, that we wouldn't have these kinds of conflicts. But the fact that I'm not expecting that to happen real soon is a reason why I'm arguing for some of these positive duties to respond when crises do emerge. I do think that we have to press much more strongly for these implementation of some of these international standards, and I think that the United States has been contributing to that, but we have not always we haven't stayed in harmony with the Geneva Conventions and what we've done with torture, for example. There have been some really serious problems there, and that's you can make a very strong case that the U.S. has violated the Geneva Conventions regarding torture, common Article 3. But anyway, my hope is that we can move in that direction, but if you're asking me to make a prediction, I'm not really predicting that it's going to happen tomorrow, but maybe over the creation of new structures of international governance is really important in this regard. And I think that's where the International Criminal Court is a step in the right direction, far from complete, but it's a step. So I'd hope to see we can move further in that direction. So.
Thank you. Thank you again, and please, would you join me in thanking our distinguished lecturer this afternoon? Thank you, Dr. Hollenbach. Terrific.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.